Okay, so this class, we're going to talk about political culture. Last class, we talked about theories of politics as a way to give us an understanding of how American politics operates now in the present and arguably within the past as well. Talking about political culture, I think, is essential because it gives us an understanding of the shared values and beliefs that people have that have both shaped the American political system, shaped the institutions of the American government, and also helps you understand really how American politics functions in the present day. You really need to understand the values that people have towards politics, how they think about politics, how that influences their behavior, and things like that. So we're going to go over that, and then next class we'll really start going more in depth, talking about the different types of, or going talking more about American institutions as you find in the Constitution. So to speak about American political culture, I've chosen two thinkers, Randolph Bourne and G.K. Chesterton, who I think have some interesting takes on it. Now, they are both, I would say, highly influenced by the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a book appropriately entitled Democracy in America way back in the early 19th century, as it says here, 1835 and 1840, actually published in 2 volumes. So Tocqueville, this is a very seminal text. This is one of the most important books ever written about American politics. What Tocqueville talks about here, I think, is still relevant today. He basically talks about how, again, democracy has kind of evolved within the United States. He talks about problems that he sees in democracy, the kind of clash and tensions that he sees produced by the American democratic system. One of the concepts that is most well known that comes out of Tocqueville is this concept of the tyranny of the majority, the imposition by the majority group within society of their values and other forms of coercion upon minorities within the United States. And that certainly makes up a big part of what Bourne is talking about in his essay, Transnational America. And I would argue has a very strong influence on Chesterton as well. Wolin, by the way, who I talked about last class with his idea of inverted totalitarianism, also wrote a book on Tocqueville, actually, entitled Between Two Worlds, the Making of a Political and Theoretical Life, published in 2001. This was also a very influential book that Wolin wrote, basically an intellectual biography of Tocqueville and worth reading as well. So if you really get into some of the main aspects of what Tocqueville is talking about here, and again, you might have trouble seeing some of this, but Tocqueville basically talks about, as the title suggests, of course, the role of democracy. Tocqueville explores the effects of democracy on American society and politics. He highlights the leveling effect of democracy, meaning how democracy in America tends to produce a kind of equality among people. Tocqueville's French, and he's coming from a highly, aristocratic society. He himself was a member of the aristocracy, so he's very much aware of these kinds of social distinctions or inequalities between people. And that, to him, was one of the things that stood out most about the United States, was that there was a kind of equality among the citizens that you did not ordinarily see in European countries. Now, obviously, Tocqueville is very much aware, of course, of the treatment of slaves, which, of course, was still an ongoing thing in his day, and aware of the treatment of women as well. But he's talking about, among the voting members of the public, among the people who were actually, included within the rubric of citizenship within the United States, there was a level of equality among those people that he did not see in European societies. Again, so the leveling effect of democracy, where social distinction and hierarchies are diminished, leads to a greater equality among citizens. He emphasizes the potential dangers of democratic tyranny, or otherwise known as the tyranny of the majority, and the importance of maintaining a balance between majority rule and the protection of individual rights and liberties. He talks about the importance of individualism within the United States. He identifies it as a prevailing characteristic of American society. He notes that Americans often prioritize their private interests and focus on personal success and well-being. Now, again, it's another distinction actually between the United States and France, one of many distinctions that he makes. So in more traditional societies where you see a greater social hierarchy that exists, Tocqueville argues that people tend to, kind of know their role, as people would say, and sort of act in the way in which their social station, expects them to, or fulfills the expectations that are sort of given to them based on their social status. Not completely, of course. Of course, France also goes through the tumultuous French Revolution, something which Tocqueville is writing in the aftermath of, but that is a distinction that he makes. So Americans, he says, I mean, and this is a fairly conservative argument, but Americans, he says, because they do feel a sense of equality among each other, are less bound by their social obligations. They're more free to sort of pursue their own, selfish interest, basically, or self-interest. And this is very much a kind of double-edged sword, right? And arguably, this is, one of the, if not the most important insight of Tocqueville's book, is that democracy sort of sets into motion this sense of equality among people, but it kind of also undermines itself at the same time. Because what happens is that as individualism becomes a more sort of prominent characteristic in American life, it leads to, as it says here, an erosion of social cohesion and a sense of community responsibility. Things that a democracy obviously depend upon for it to maintain a democratic form of government. You need the citizens to have a certain sense of cohesiveness, of cooperation with each other, a sense of responsibility, a sense of concern, not just to their own interest, but the public interest. And he argues that democracy kind of undermines those things. So at the same time in which it sort of frees people up to pursue their own individual self-interest, it kind of undermines the very things which a democracy needs to thrive and to persist. So that's a very sort of interesting point. And it's all sort of like an internal characteristic. These things are very much in tension with each other. Related to that point, he also, emphasizes the importance of civic associations, the proliferation of voluntary associations in America, associations that, exist outside of the government, private associations, clubs, things like that, neighborhood organizations and things like that. Tocqueville argues that these are, again, very essential in maintaining democratic government. Again, he recognizes these civic and social organizations as essential elements of American democracy, providing a sense of belonging, promoting civil engagement, and encouraging collective problem solving. These associations act as a counterbalance to the potential tyranny of the majority. Again, the term which he's widely associated with. And the way in which that works is that it sort of instills habits and even skills of cooperation. Cooperation is not just something that you can take for granted. People have to sort of learn to a certain extent to cooperate with each other. And he argues that these associations, which in many ways, predate the American government, going back to the colonial period, and of course existing afterwards, are again a very crucial element of democracy within America. It also suggests the idea that, again, for a democracy to continue to function, people have to have the right kind of attitudes and values, and even, like I said, skills, maybe even organizational skills. In the light of things like the US's attempt to impose democratic government in other parts of the world, again, Wollen's book is published in 2001, not too long before the United States invades Iraq, and the same year, in fact, in which of course, the United States invades Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks. I mean, those foreign invasions, interventions, whatever you want to call them, were largely premised on this idea that somehow we were going to, export democracy to these other countries. Tocqueville would, if he was around, obviously would argue, would be highly skeptical of that, right? Because how can you impose a democratic form of government on a country that doesn't have a prior history of the kind of associational life that you would associate with democracy. Both these countries, of course, were very tightly run authoritarian societies, and had not, at least in modern times that I'm aware of, had any strong element of civic association and people sort of acting in a cooperative, open way. Without those things being there, it would be very hard to imagine democracy taking root within these countries, and of course they did not. So that's another important aspect of it. You can't just arbitrarily impose a democratic government on any society. You need to have the right kind, again, political culture in place, the right kind of values and beliefs in place to make that happen. Again, related to this is the also he gives a great importance to local self-governance. The so-called New England Township Meeting was sort of his model for this. But the idea that they have sort of small-scale local governance, not just a far-off, remote authority in some capital city that's detached from the affairs of people living in small townships and villages and things like that in far away places. But there was a higher level of self-governance within the United States. Again, particularly the township as an embodiment of democratic principles. He admired the active participation of citizens in local decision-making and how this practice nurtures a spirit of civic responsibility and democratic culture. Finally, and I mean, there's a lot more that you can add to this, but finally, for now, for our purposes at least, Tocqueville talks about the importance of religion and morality as well. So again, and this will also relate, very much to what Chesterton and Bourne are talking about, the importance of religious values within American life. Of course, when we're talking about the history of the United States, we're talking about, the Pilgrims and the Puritans and groups like that. Well, primarily them. But he highlights the significant influence of religion in American society. He credits, again, the Puritans for instilling a strong moral foundation that contributed to the success of democracy in America. He believes that religious values promote social order, and religious institutions play a vital role in fostering a sense of community and civic virtue. Something else which we'll talk more about as we go through this. Now, if I could sort of boil this down a little bit from what I just said, kind of highlighting the same points, but maybe in a more simplified way, there are certain, again, tensions and contradictions that exist within American political life, things which Tocqueville is very much aware of, and I would argue that largely his reputation as a seminal thinker and the importance of this book today largely rests on these things. So again, he sees the contradiction between democracy and individualism within the United States. That the United States, by virtue of its democratic organization of political life, at least for certain segments of the population, actually creates a sense of individualism within people. That the sense of, again, equality between citizens within the United States contributes to a sense of individualism within these people, which actually threatens to undermine democratic government as more and more people sort of tune out from public life and sort of retreat into their own private lives. I mean, this might be, like I said, his most important insight, and probably the one that is arguably maybe the most relevant today, because if you look at contemporary American society, it is a society where people are largely privatized or individualized and have for the most part retreated into their own private lives. Now again, it's not because of something sort of external or some sort of external threat that has come in from the outside. It is simply through the operations of a democracy itself that actually produces these things. And the sort of counteracting forces, the things which promote a sense of cooperation and community spirit and things like that, seem to be overwhelmed. And Tocqueville was aware of it in his day, but it seemed to become much more of a reality in the world that we live in now. So these things are in tension with each other. Again, democracy itself contributes to that sense of individualism, particularly the notion of equality between the citizens, but threatens to sort of undermine it at the same time. The political values of liberty and equality also exist in tension with each other. we love in the United States to talk about liberty and equality all the time. We can't stop talking about it, in fact. And we act as if these things are just kind of, that they kind of harmonize with each other, or they just go with each other naturally. To a certain extent, maybe, but again, there are also tensions that exist between them as well. To create a greater sense of equality among the people, do we restrict the liberty of people, particularly their right to own property and things like that? On the other hand, do we allow for a greater liberty to people, even though it undermines a sense of equality? And also, I would add to that, as society becomes more and more unequal, it tends to take away a lot of the freedom of the lower classes within the United States as well. So those are two things which exist in conflict with each other. Again, Tocqueville would usually refer to it as equality of conditions. That again, that the Americans have a sense of equality among each other. They don't see themselves as being of noble birth, or that there's a kind of aristocracy of people that are by virtue of birth on a higher level than other people. And I would argue you still see that to this very day, to a large extent, right? Americans tend to have a more kind of populist approach to culture, things like that. We are very suspicious, and maybe rightfully so, of people that are perceived to be elitist or snobs and things like that. That is certainly a very, I think, strong aspect of American culture that you still see to this very day. Again, the tension between the majority and the minority, another important conflict that you see playing out within American politics. And again, I mean, probably, next to the idea of individualism undermining democracy, probably the idea that Tocqueville is most known for, that there's a sort of constant danger that the numerically larger group will attempt to impose itself, will attempt to coerce minority groups, whether it's a religious minority, an ethnic minority, or various other ways in which you can think of to divide people up. That there's always the danger of the majority group sort of imposing its will upon the minority group. And again, you then see a strong tension between local government and centralization. The idea of a decentralized government where affairs are mostly locally governed versus a centralized government which rules in a capital city and basically administers the affairs of the society as a whole. That did not exist to a great extent in Tocqueville's day, though he was very much aware of the possibility for it. And again, in the world in which we live in now, that has become much more of a reality. I mean, we still do have, as we'll talk about more when we talk about federalism within the United States, we do have more of a separation of power between state, local, and federal governments. But unquestionably, the power of the federal government has grown to a significant extent as well. And then finally, and again, there's certainly more that you could explore this, but I mean, for our purposes here, I think this will put a point to it. But you also have a tension between religion and secularism as well. You have if Tocqueville argues that religious values, particularly Christian values, play an important role in sustaining American democracy, then what happens then when religious values tend to decline within the country, as they have? And we'll look at some survey data to support that claim shortly. Is there another way to substitute it? Do you really need to have religious values to maintain a democracy, or are there other types of values which will sort of substitute for that? If not, then what happens? Does that mean then that if people turn away from religion, that democratic government cannot last very longer? Certainly, a lot of people probably do believe that. I'm not sure I do, but it is an interesting question to take up. So that's sort of a preamble, or like I said, I mean, I didn't assign any readings by Tocqueville himself. I did assign readings by Bourne and Chesterton, though hopefully after going through this, it'll seem quite obvious why Tocqueville's ideas seem to play a very strong influence on it. So let's talk a little bit about Bourne first. So Bourne is writing this essay called Transnational America in 1916. While World War I is going on, although the U.S. has yet to enter the war, but there are a lot of things going on related to that, which are definitely factor in to what he is talking about, particularly this tyranny of the majority, the tendency for the majority group within America, basically white people, specifically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, to impose their will culturally, politically, economically upon minority groups within the country. In this case, specifically within or on immigrant groups. So the term transnational never really caught on, I would say, at least in the context in which Bourne is talking about. But basically, it seems more akin to what we would today refer to as multiculturalism. To what extent is the United States a multicultural country? To what extent is it a country that appreciates and allows for different cultural groups to sort of practice their own culture, to sort of practice their own way of life without being, again, having the dominant majority sort of imposing its values upon them? Bourne sees this as something that's significantly under threat within the United States at this point. And I would obviously argue that this is something that you still see happening, playing out in contemporary American politics today. He's very much worried about cultures, different ethnic cultures being washed away in a kind of bland American culture, this kind of mainstream, very homogenized culture, which he refers to as the tasteless, colorless fluid of humanity, and later on refers to as flotsam and jetsam, which is like a very unpleasant thing that kind of washes up from the from the shore, basically. Now again, I mean, when we think about modern day consumerism within the United States, this kind of consumer culture, which is very sort of kind of empty and hollow in many ways, and maybe is based upon some kind of ethnic ideas going far back, but has become very much a kind of homogenized thing, which is kind of sort of contentless. It doesn't have any really strong ethnic overtone to it. Chesterton would argue that the principles of political philosophy within the Declaration of Independence, which he also more or less shares an agreement with Bourne for the most part, is what he calls the creed of America. This idea that there are sort of common core values, again, going back to this idea of political culture within the United States, but that these values stress tolerance, stress a kind of openness, stress, again, a sense of equality, which means not, preferencing or being biased towards one group over the other. So Bourne here, I'll read a little bit of what he says. I think this passage here more or less, sums up a lot of what he's talking about. So he writes, to face the fact that our aliens, meaning people coming into the country, are already strong enough to take a share in the direction of their own destiny, and that the strong cultural movements represented by the foreign press, schools, and colonies are a challenge to our facile attempts, is not, however, to admit the failure of Americanization. It is not to fear the failure of democracy. It is rather to urge us to an investigation of what Americanism may rightly mean. So, of course, he's implying that Americanization, basically another word for assimilation, has been a failure. It's been a failure, primarily because what you have are the dominant group within society, whites, though even more specifically, white people from England, Protestant whites, have, again, very forcefully sort of imposed their values upon other groups, non-whites, non-Protestants, non-English people. And what you have, again, are a very, aggressive attempt to impose these values upon people, which is met with a lot of resistance, to the extent to which people do conform, people outside of that group conform to those values. He has a lot of kind of contempt, quite frankly, for people who are, essentially, trying too hard to assimilate to these kind of white Protestant values. And this is sort of being amplified by what's going on with the war, right? Because what's going on is that you have a world war, though primarily fought within Europe, with the English and the French and the Russians actually on one side against the Germans and the Austrians, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire on the other. But primarily Germany on the other side. And in the United States, there was a lot of resentment and fear and suspicion over Germans within the United States. Quite frankly, without jumping ahead too much, I mean, if I were to find a modern day parallel with that today, I would probably say with Chinese people, Chinese citizens and residents within the United States. There's been a lot, since the Trump administration, there's been a lot of heightening and emphasizing and cultivating a fear of Chinese people, fear that they're spying on us, trying to steal our technology and our trade secrets and things like that. A lot of resentment directed, again, primarily by Trump, I would say, but also by many other people, towards Chinese people for COVID. Very, very wrongly, blaming China for the spread of COVID across the world, which is obviously not the fault or responsibility of any government or of any people. As far as this theory of escaping from a lab leak, there's not any evidence to support that theory at all that I'm aware of. If anything, most of the credible evidence supports the fact that it had a kind of natural origin to it. So between those things, between heightened fears of Chinese espionage and sort of scapegoating, basically scapegoating China for COVID, there seems to be a significant rise in hate crimes and things like that towards China. Just earlier, I was reading something about that, and NBC News reported a 339% increase in hate crimes against, I don't remember if they said specifically Chinese people, but or against Asian Americans in particular, but a significant rise. Another report says that 1 in 3 Asian Americans have actually changed their behavior, have sort of changed their daily routines because they're afraid of being attacked by people, meaning they don't go out as much anymore, they don't go out into certain public places as much anymore. So this has been a significant heightening of it, and you can certainly blame a lot of it on Trump, but quite frankly, even with Trump out of office, I mean, it doesn't seem to have died down very much either. I mean, the U.S., the Biden administration may not explicitly blame China for things that the way Trump did, but you still hear a lot of talk, a lot of fear about Chinese espionage and Chinese spies operating within the United States and things like that. Very much reminiscent of what's going on here in World War I, or probably the strongest parallel that people would draw to it would be in the late 1940s and the 1950s during the so-called anti-communist witch hunts that followed World War II and the era of McCarthyism. In fact, many people, use the term neo-McCarthyism or neo-McCarthyite to speak about what's going on now. Anyway, so going back to the quote, it is rather to urge us to an investigation of what Americanism may rightly mean. It is to ask ourselves whether our ideal has been broad or narrow, whether perhaps the time has not come to assert a higher ideal than the melting pot. So that's another interesting phrase, and the people often talk about this idea. Yeah, I'm sure everyone has heard that at least once, that the United States is a melting pot. We all melt together, apparently. And Bourne saying that, well, is that really such a good thing? Because what does that term mean? It's basically something that sort of erases the distinctions among people. We all certainly just become this sort of like indistinct liquid, this sort of fluid, which all just kind of merges together and lacks distinct qualities. It erases those things or melts them. He's not so sure that is necessarily an ideal, which is an interesting idea, because how many people take that idea for granted and never even think to question it. Anyway, he says, surely we cannot be certain of our spiritual democracy, again, meaning a kind of political culture, I would say, when claiming to melt the nations within us to a comprehension of our free and democratic institutions. We fly into panic at the first sign of their own will and tendency. We act as if we wanted Americanization to take place only on our own terms and not by the consent of the governed. Again, consent of the governed being a core American concept as well. that government exists, political power exists, but it has essentially the approval of the people who are being governed, meaning the people, that the people give their consent essentially to what the government is doing and how the government is actually exercising power. All our elaborate machinery of settlement and school and union, of social and political naturalization, however, it will move with friction just insofar as it neglects to take into account the strong and virile insistence that America shall be what the immigrant will have a hand in making it, and not what a ruling class, descendant of those British stocks, which were the first permanent immigrants, decide that America shall be made. This is the condition which confronts us and which demands a clear and general readjustment of our attitude and our ideal. He goes on to say, we are all foreign-born or the descendants of foreign-born. And if distinctions are to be made between us, they should rightly be on some other ground than indigenousness, meaning people who were born within the country. So again, a clear conflict then between people who were born within the country versus people who have emigrated to the country. The early colonists came over with motives no less colonial than the later. They did not come to be assimilated in an American melting pot. They did not come to adopt the culture of the American Indian. And of course, what he's doing is, making reference to the fact that the earliest American settlers here, colonial settlers, did not come to live according to the ways of the so-called American Indian. Quite the opposite, as we all know. And almost immediately started about a process of genocide against the American Indian, taking their land, killing them, reducing their population, something which became only worse, really after the founding of the United States. Incidentally, when Tocqueville is visiting the United States to write his book, Democracy in America, Andrew Jackson is president, one of the most infamous American presidents as far as their sort of, very coercive policies against Indians living within the United States. He goes on to say, the truth is that no more tenacious cultural allegiance to the mother country has been shown by any alien nation than by the ruling class of Anglo-Saxon descendants in these American states. Anglo-Saxon means basically the English. English snobberies, English religion, English literary styles, English literary reverences and canons, English ethics, English superiorities have been the cultural food that we have drunk in from our mother's breasts. And that is still true to an extent today, not so much more. Today, I think we would define things much more in terms of white and black and brown, and less explicitly in terms of simply being English. Although that did exist for a very long period of time. One of the more interesting aspects, the more interesting sort of sociological aspects of that is what sociologists term this phenomenon, I believe it's called passing. In other words, trying to pass yourself off as the dominant group. Now, obviously, if we define this in terms of skin color, then only white immigrants are able to do so, although many of them did. Many Italian people changed their names, from more, ethnic sounding Italian names to more Anglo-Saxon sounding names. The singers, Dean Martin, Tony Bennett, have very ethnic sounding names. Dean Martin's real name, used to hang out with Frank Sinatra and things like that. I don't know how Frank Sinatra he kept his name, maybe because he had a mafioso manager or something like that. So he didn't have to play that game maybe. But Dean Martin's real name is like it's like Dino Martino or something like that. It's a very kind of ethnic sounding name. Tony Bennett, I forget what his name is, but he was also of Italian descent as well. Now they're also in show business, and people often do that in show business as well. But there are many other incidences of that, maybe not as well known, of people doing things like that. The creator of The Sopranos, David Chase, was born De Cesare or something like that. His father actually changed his name, again, to a more sort of Anglo-sounding name. Many Jewish people did that as well. Jack Kirby the creator of the Marvel comics characters. There's a whole story about how that guy kind of got screwed over and didn't receive the proper credit for it, which I won't go into here. But Jack Kirby's real name was Jacob Kurtzberg. He changed his name to, again, to sort of, pass yourself off as the dominant ethnic group, to pass yourself off as the majority rather than the minority. Stanley as well. Stanley's real name was Stanley Lieber. Although I think in his case, I think he may have changed his name, like a pseudonym, because I think he had some aspirations to be like a novelist or something like that, and didn't want people to know that he was writing comic books or something. But Lieber is also, a fairly ethnic sounding, Jewish name as well. So you see lots of instances of that, and for good reason. There was significant discrimination against those groups, at least for a period of time. City College of New York, CCNY, was for many years known as the Jewish Harvard, at a time where Jewish people were literally either outright banned from going to Harvard, or I believe they may have had some kind of quota system in place where they had only let in a very small amount of Jewish students. I mean, that basically lasted until the 1960s. So that's another example of that. Now, again, obviously, if you don't have the same skin complexion as the Anglo-Saxons did, this was a bit harder. And I've yet to talk about Black people living within America as well, who were not immigrant groups, obviously, in contrast to what Ben Carson and various other people on the right may think. So what remains of English culture today? I've already sort of suggested to some extent that the sort of cultural pull or appeal of England, descending again from the Puritans and the Pilgrims, who, for what it's worth, fled England. So they weren't exactly great admirers of at least the English political system, although perhaps they brought a lot of those cultural values with them. I mean, to what extent is the country still a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country to this very day, often known by the acronym WASP, if you've ever heard that term? Well, ironically, probably the least appreciated aspect of it is that the political institutions of our government still largely descend from, in some ways at least, from the Puritan political institutions of legislative government and things like that. Obviously, at a very smaller level. This would be something, again, that Tocqueville talks about. To what extent is the United States still a Christian country, though? That's a very interesting thing. And for here, as you can see, I've included a link. I'd like to then switch over to my web browser for a second. This is the Pew Research Center's survey on religion within the United States. And they do this every couple of years. I believe this is the most recent one from 2021. And they basically, like all surveys, maybe should be taken with a grain of salt to a certain extent. And by that, I mean, don't accept it as the gospel truth. No pun intended. But, the way in which these surveys usually work is that they sample a certain group of Americans, usually a few hundred, maybe a few thousand even, which they claim are randomly sampled. And they would argue, at least, that even though it's a relatively small group of people, that it is sort of representative of opinions as a whole. Many, groups do these kinds of polls and surveys. Truthfully, I generally don't put a great stock or value upon polls. But at the same time, I do understand that it at least gives you some kind of knowledge about things, and some knowledge, partial knowledge is better than nothing at all. So if we can take this as any kind of indication of religious attitudes within the United States, I think it paints an interesting picture. And I'm not going to go into their methodology and how they conducted the poll. I'm purely just interested in the results of the poll. Now, if you do read this, and you can, obviously, since I provided the link to it, you can sort of see, this is just sort of capturing a snapshot, if you will, at a certain point in time. But they do compare this to previous surveys as well. And they find that religious attitudes, religious identifications, I guess you would call it, have declined to a fairly significant amount within the United States. So right off the bat, they say there's about 63% of Americans consider themselves to be Christian. And as you can see, they sort of break that down a little bit further. Now, that is according to their poll from about a decade ago. That is down from about 78%. So a fairly significant decline from almost 80% to just over 60%. 60% obviously still the vast majority of people, but a significant decline as well. Whereas at the same time, those who are not religiously affiliated are almost 30%, almost doubling from about a decade ago, where I think they reported as about 16%. So not quite doubling, but almost doubling during that period of time, or just over the course of the last decade. And again, as you break it down more, within Christians within the United States, 43% identify as Protestant. So most Christians within the United States consider themselves to be Protestant, which would have been the religion of the Puritans, the modern day descendants of the Puritan faith. For those who are interested, would be the Presbyterian Church. Although you also have the Episcopalians, which kind of are the counterpart to the Church of England, although the group that the Puritans were basically trying to get themselves away from. It doesn't break it down here. I've seen other surveys where it does actually break it down by Protestant denomination. Unfortunately, it does not do that here. You can check some of the older polls if you want, provided by this group, the Pew Research Center. So anyway, 43% identify as Protestant overall. They then break it down in terms of evangelical, non-evangelical. The evangelicals, if you don't know, are basically, those who consider themselves to be born-again Christians. They are generally, and I hope I'm not being unfair, they're generally the most sort of right-wing conservative Christians. I mean, these are the very strong anti-abortion crowd. They came out in very strong numbers to support Donald Trump. Catholics do as well, obviously, opposed to abortion. But the born-agains are, basically mostly what makes up the so-called Christian right or religious right within the United States. And again, I kind of wish they didn't separate in terms of white and black, because it kind of breaks things up a little bit. But white evangelicals make up 16%, white non-evangelicals make up 12%, black Protestants are 7%, all others 8%. Then it goes down to Catholic. 19% identify as Catholic, 10% are white, 7% Hispanic, 2% all others. Mormons make up 2%. And then it basically shows you the other faiths. Jewish, total other faiths make up only 7%. Jewish makes up 2%. Muslims only make up 1%. Buddhists make up 1%. Hindus make up less than 1%. Other is 3%. I'm not sure what they mean by that. Muslims make up a very small amount of the American public. Yet again, if you were to take people on the right seriously, you would think that we are, days away from imposing Sharia law upon the United States. This is the kind of exaggerated, often hysterical claims that you often hear from people on the right. So other faiths, very, very small amount. Again, Christians still make up a large group. Of that group, Protestants make up the largest group. So to what extent is the United States still a Christian country? Well, it is, but it's clearly going down. And to the extent in which they are Protestant, still the largest, if you break it up into different groups, still make up the plurality, meaning the largest group, but not a true majority. So is the United States still a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country? Much less so than it has been prior to this. Catholics generally tend to be a lot of Catholics in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany to some extent, in Latin America as well. So usually not, Anglo-Saxon. There are not that many Anglo-Saxon Catholics. Chesterton, ironically enough, he was an English writer who also was Catholic, but Catholics make up a very small minority within England. But again, and the other big part about this is, again, the growth of religiously non-affiliated people. Now, To almost 30%. Atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, which is kind of funny because that's the largest of that group, and they're just I guess don't have any belief at all. Now that's another thing, of the 63% that are Christian, and maybe the survey goes into this more. I wonder how many of these people actually really feel. I mean, it's easy to imagine a lot of people who call themselves Christian or identify as being Christian, but probably don't take things very seriously. Maybe they go to church once or twice a year on the big holidays. Maybe they go every Sunday, but still might not take it very seriously at all. It's hard, obviously, to figure out to what extent people like that are heavily invested in the religion. I guess you could try to find how often people go to church and things like that, and maybe they do some things like that. I know at one point they asked people like how often they pray and things like that. But even if you go to church every Sunday, I mean, it still doesn't necessarily mean that the religion actually plays a significant role in your life. So of that 63%, I wonder how many of these people actually are, very devout Christians. My guess would be not very many. Maybe you'd cut that number down by half, or maybe even more. I don't know. Anyway, so going back to the PowerPoint here, another important aspect is what is often referred to as the Protestant work ethic. This idea, an idea put forward by the sociologist Max Weber in the early 20th century, that it was the Protestant work ethic of hard work, thriftiness, efficiency, work hard, save your money, that led to the development of capitalism, basically. That's what caused capitalism essentially to take off within certain countries. So what Weber does is he supplies a kind of cultural argument, supposedly to go against the Marxist argument of what led to capitalism taking off. I would say that the Marxist argument makes a lot more sense. So according to Marx, how did capitalism take off? Well, basically, you have the development of commercial agriculture. You have farming changing from subsistence farming to farming in order to make a profit, which of course would include slave labor as well as a slave trade. You have basically a movement that took place over many centuries in England. England is basically the first country to really become a capitalist country. So you could really focus a lot on English history and try to make sense of that. But there was a very strong movement that took place over centuries to basically throw the peasants off their land, what is often referred to as the enclosure of the commons, lands that were basically prior to this held in common. There was no clear ownership over it, to basically one day someone saying, well, this land's now mine, get the hell off. And then basically having the government, the political authorities, support them in that, in throwing the peasants off land. Also very much sort of undermines the whole sort of myth of capitalism, developing only in the private sphere, not making use of government authority. Turns out that political authority played a very big role in the development of capitalism. Anyway, that's a whole nother question. We don't have to get into that too much, but the argument has been made, of course, that the so-called Protestant work ethic played a very big part in capitalism. Now, even if it didn't lead to the development of capitalism, you could still argue, which I don't think it did, you could still argue that it played an important role in facilitating the growth of capitalism, or that the Protestant work ethic sort of shaped in reaction to what was going on in the economic sphere. That the economic sphere, again, the development of commercial agriculture, throwing people off the land. These people who get thrown off their land then flood into the cities and become the proletariat there. That these attitudes, these values kind of develop in reaction to that, which is an interesting thing. Now, we still have that, I think, to a certain extent. I mean, some people would now term this to be the American work ethic. And a lot of people still think, if you work very hard and save all your money, that you're going to become rich one day. Well, maybe for some people, but when you look at the economic statistics within the country, the American economy grows, half as fast as it was during the 1950s and 1960s. Productivity growth within the economy is basically slowed to almost zero, basically just about 1%. There are a lot of bigger things at at play here, I think, in other words, that I don't think you could just blame on people working hard or not working hard. And, and I say that fully knowing, of course, that many people do try to make those arguments, but I don't think it's because there are too many people on welfare that the economy is not, is growing much slower than it was in the 1950s, 1960s. If anything, we had more extensive welfare back then. I mean, welfare since the 1990s has basically been gutted anyway. And even though we've essentially significantly rolled back on social welfare within this country, it hasn't really done anything at all to stimulate the economy to grow any faster. The U.S., as I've already mentioned, lags behind in social rights. Most other countries guarantee rights to healthcare, education, housing, and things like that. The U.S. doesn't guarantee any of those things. Certainly more disturbing aspects of English culture, though, by no means, unique to English culture. White supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia still exist as well. Certainly, you can't blame that all on the English. Those are things that you see, particularly, patriarchy and homophobia, of course, you see within many other cultures as well. And I would say all those values have, at least since the 1960s, have become much more challenged as well. So what remains of English culture today? I would say it's much less of a presence. I think that's in light of all this, I would say that's fairly obvious. English cultural, going back to what Bourne said about English snobberies and taste and things like that being dominant. Clearly, the world has changed a lot since he was writing. This is an article that was over 100 years ago. Not completely, again, according to that survey, still 60% of Americans identify as Christian. Of that group, the largest are Protestant, which mainly comes from England to a large extent. I would say besides those cultural aspects, again, probably the longest lasting legacy of English culture would be in the political institutions themselves, though. And this is sort of another diagram of how the so-called Protestant work ethic works. I'm not going to go through that here, but if you care to look through on the PowerPoint, you can. Now, switching gears for a second to talk about Chesterton. He makes a similar point. He writes that the American Constitution resembles the Spanish Inquisition, which is an interesting thing to say. The Spanish Inquisition, if you don't know, was this infamous court in the Middle Ages that basically tried people for heresy and for blasphemy, for basically not being a Christian. And it's significant that it was a force in Spain. Spain had a very large Jewish and Muslim population at one point. In fact, was conquered by Muslims in the early Middle Ages. And so this court, under the authority of the Catholic Church, forms and very coercively, we're talking about burning people at the stake and torturing people. There's all these horrible things to try to, enforce, Catholic values upon people. So he's saying that the Constitution is like that, which is obviously not a flattering thing to say. But he means this in a kind of ironic way. If you read Chesterton, hopefully you can tell that, or it stands out that he's trying to be a very kind of humorous writer for the most part, kind of has a humorous appearance as well. America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed, he says. That creed is set forth. So again, we're thinking of it in a kind of religious term, right? A creed is kind of a religious, statement of religious belief, like in the Catholic Church, the Apostles' Creed and things like that, where you sort of state what your core values are, essentially. That creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the only piece of practical politics that is also theoretical politics and also great literature. It enunciates that all men are equal in their claim to justice. So this is basically saying, well, what this creed is, that there's a claim to justice, that all people have an equal right to justice. The governments exist to give them that justice, that is the purpose of government, to preserve justice, to preserve the equality between people. And that their authority is for that reason just. So the only reason why government has any authority at all is to the extent in which it provides for justice. If it is not doing that, then it's an illegitimate government. That's a very sort of powerful critique that you can make of our current day government, especially in light of what we were talking about last class, or of any government for that matter. It certainly does condemn anarchism. This is in reference to something he speaks of earlier when he's going through the passport office. And it does also, by inference, condemn atheism, since it clearly names the creator as the ultimate authority from whom these equal rights are derived. Now, Chesterton was actually, like I said, actually a fairly devout Catholic. So his condemnation of atheism, I think, is maybe his own, idiosyncratic view. I'm not sure if the Constitution necessarily, or the Declaration rather, does necessarily say that. It does reference a creator, not necessarily the Christian God. Although, again, you would have to acknowledge that religion, up until recent times, we're only talking about a decade ago, where almost 80% of Americans would identify as being Christian, has certainly played a very big role for a very long time. Anyway, he says, nobody expects a modern political system to proceed logically in the application of such dogmas, and in the matter of God and government, it is naturally God whose claim is taken more lightly. The point is that there is a creed, if not about divine, at least about human things. He goes on to say, now in a much vaguer, more evolutionary fashion, there is something of the same idea at the back of the great American experiment, the experiment of a democracy of diverse races, which has been compared to a melting pot. So he, again, references the melting pot, but in a more positive way than how Bourne does. But even that metaphor implies that the pot itself is of a certain shape and a certain substance. The melting pot must not melt. The original shape was traced on the lines of Jeffersonian democracy, and it will remain in that shape until it becomes shapeless. America invites all men to become citizens, but it implies the dogma that there is such a thing as citizenship. Only so far as its primary ideal is concerned, is exclusiveness is religious because it is not racial, so he says. So basically what he's saying is that the United States is different in the fact that it imposes a kind of almost like religious-like dogma upon people. Because, at least in theory, it opens itself up to the idea that anybody from any ethnic group can become an American citizen. And he's saying that because it does not have a explicit racial or ethnic characteristic to it, at least in its ideal form, obviously the reality falls very short of that. But because in theory it does not have a specific ethnic type or identification to it, it instills a kind of religious-like devotion to certain values, or again, to a certain type of political culture. Now, going back again to Bourne, and Chesterton is only writing a short time after Bourne. Bourne wrote this article shortly before the U.S. Joined World War I, ostensibly to make the world safe for democracy. At least that's the claim that was made by Woodrow Wilson, the president at that time, a Democrat. Interestingly enough, if you look at most of the wars throughout the 20th century, they were started by Democrats, not necessarily the war itself, but the U.S. entry into the war was under Democratic administrations, including World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. During this period of time, and I've already kind of referenced this to some extent already, there was a crackdown on so-called hyphenated Americans, as well as upon socialists and anarchists, as I talk about in the article that I wrote from last class. Hyphenated Americans was basically the term that was used back then to speak to people or to speak of people as if they were not somehow pure Americans. The descendants of the British stocks, as Bourne would call them. They didn't say that they were English Americans or something like that, or Puritan Americans. They were just Americans. But everybody else was an Irish American, Italian American, a Polish American, a Jewish American. And what that meant by, focusing on the hyphenated aspect of it was that they were less pure. They weren't pure Americans. Yeah, they were Americans, kind of, but they weren't as pure as the British. And of course, there's a whole history to that. I mean, leading up to the war. I reference it here in the PowerPoint, but I won't really go into it too much because I don't want things to go on too long. But you would have to then go into what was going on in the war, this rivalry between different capitalist powers, empires. being sort of generated by conflicts within the capitalist system, leading to war. Bourgeois historians have tried to argue that you can't really blame capitalism on World War One, but their arguments are not very good, I would say. One historian, Neil Ferguson, doesn't think that you can blame, attribute capitalism to World War One because the capitalists didn't want the war to happen. Well, that's a very lame argument. That's like saying that because capitalists didn't want the economy to crash in 2008, you can't blame capitalism on that, or blame capitalism for any economic recession, for that matter. Marx is very explicit about the idea that capitalism kind of works by its own logic, and even the capitalists themselves are not fully in control of things. So things happen, which business leaders or capitalists may not want. The point, though, is that these conflicts that are generated by the capitalist system lead to these things happening, whether they want to happen or not. Anyway, like I said, that's a very big question, which I won't get into too much. Now, what led to the U.S. getting into the war? Was it because of the sinking of the Lusitania, which happened 2 years almost before the U.S. gets into the war? Was it the Zimmerman telegram that the Germans sent to the Mexican government? Those are sort of the conventional sort of history textbook explanations of what led the U.S. getting into the war. Almost never mentioned, at least not when I was in school, was that the American bankers like J.P. Morgan had loaned a tremendous amount of money to the Allies, particularly to England, over $2 billion, and that's back then. So that number today would be greatly higher. They had also loaned money to Germany, only 27 million though. So most of the money they had lent was to the Allies, again, particularly to England. And I think there was a lot of fear that if the British and the French lost the war, the Americans weren't going to get paid back. And this is a very good argument I think you can make that was what really preceded the U.S. getting involved in the war. Now, this is kind of historical context, but I mean, Wilson, as you can see here, this is from his campaign in 1916. Wilson was elected in 1912 and ran for re-election in 1916 while the war was going on, the same year in which this article is written. Wilson ran on a policy of neutrality. He ran claiming that he was going to keep the U.S. out of the war, as you can see here on this truck. This is how people used to campaign before we had social media. It lists some of his accomplishments or some of the things that they're trying to emphasize about him. Who broke the money trust? Wilson was a progressive, so did take some actions to sort of rein in the worst abuses of the capitalist system. But as you can see, who keeps us out of war? That was one of the main things which they emphasized back then. Who stands for the 8-hour workday as opposed to the 10 or 12-hour workday, which is what people had back then. So this idea of keeping the U.S. out of war was a very important part of his re-election campaign, and possibly is what got him re-elected. But he was lying. I mean, it's now been revealed that behind the scenes, Wilson had already made up his mind that the U.S. was going to have to get involved in this war. So even though he's running on a campaign of neutrality, behind the scenes, he's already basically preparing for the U.S. to get involved in the war. And just to emphasize it again, you can really see that this was a very important part of his campaign. They even printed up, campaign buttons about it. Again, another pre-social media campaign tactic. One of the people who was opposed to the war was a socialist leader, Eugene Debs. Again, I mentioned this in the article that I wrote. Debs was the leader of the Socialist Party in the United States, who had run for president several times prior to this. Was convicted under the Espionage Act, the same law which has been used to convict Chelsea Manning and which Julian Assange and Edward Snowden have been charged under, and put him in jail basically for opposition to the war. Will you go to jail for opposing a war in this country? Apparently, and it didn't just happen to him either. Technically, they were convicted for opposing the draft. Back then, you had a draft, which is where people were conscripted, basically forced to fight within the war. We no longer have a draft anymore, which was gotten rid of during the Vietnam War, not by a constitutional amendment either or anything like that. So in theory, they could still bring it back, by the way. But him and many other socialists and anarchists were convicted for opposing the draft, interfering with the draft, obstructing it, which was the law. If you did not abide by the draft, or if you interfered with soldiers serving, that was considered a crime, and many people were arrested for that. And Debs was as well, even though he's a much older man at this point. What this happens, it actually leads to Debs running his fifth and final presidential campaign from prison in 1920, which he was still in prison, by the way, even after the war ended. Now, this is obviously a cartoon. To give a little more gravity to it, this is an actual real picture of Debs after he was in prison. I mean, he had been in prison several times prior to this, in fact. As you can see, he's a much older man, rather frail. Wilson hated this guy. Wilson refused to pardon him, the Democrat. He was pardoned in the next presidential administration because at this point it had become a significant public issue. I mean, a lot of people were outraged by this. That you're throwing this guy into prison because he was opposed to a war which is now over. He's an elder man. He's in frail health. Why won't you release this guy? The next president after Wilson, a Republican, Warren G. Harding, did, but Debs died within a few years of this. I mean, this is during a period of time where prison would significantly impact your health in many ways due to the poor living conditions there. Anyway, so when you talk about World War I, you can't not talk about the enormous propaganda efforts that were launched back then. And these are examples of some of the propaganda posters that you had. There was an enormous attempt, really an unprecedented attempt at that point in time to really manipulate public opinion to support the war. There's really nothing prior to this that spoke to the same extent. Largely, I think in some ways driven by advances within mass media. Although mass media was still in its sort of earliest stages at this point in time, to really sort of, as they would say, manufacture consent to support the war. Parades, posters, the famous Broadway composer George Cohan, who was later the subject of a movie with James Cagney called Yankee Doodle Dandy, did these very, patriotic, jingoistic, plays and musicals to support the war as well. You can kind of see here that they're sort of playing on one kind of emotion, fear, this idea that you got, destroy this mad brute, meaning the Germans, showing, bloody bayonets and things like that there. So appealing to sort of one emotion on one level, here appealing to something else, a sense of purity, maybe even a subtle hint of sexuality, quite frankly. This poster is pretty funny. Gee, I wish I were a man. I join the Navy. Be a man and do it. This is an attempt that someone has made. I don't know what they were going for here. Obviously, these are actual propaganda posters, but they've been doctored, obviously, during COVID, during the early days of COVID, to encourage people to wear a mask. I mean, are they? I don't know where this is coming from. I'm assuming that this is a sincere attempt. Like, they're not just like making fun of this, or they're not like sort of critiquing the heavy-handedness of the government. But really, that's what really comes through here, right? I mean, if you're actually trying to create a message to get people to wear masks, this is a rather strange way to go about it, because you're referencing these propaganda posters, which was all about manipulating people. Like why would you want to reference something like that if you want people to actually wear a mask? You don't want to reference this time where, or remind people of a time where the government basically lied to people and brainwashed them in order to do something that went against their own interests. So I don't know, lack of historical knowledge here, assuming, of course, that this is actually a sincere attempt to get people to wear a mask. Now, one of the consequences of the war, or really a consequence of this, crackdown on hyphenated Americans. Oh, and of course, I have to point out that during this period of time, there was an enormous persecution of Germans and of German culture. I like I said, try to draw a modern day parallel to Chinese people living within the United States. Although, since most people can't tell the difference between Chinese and Japanese and Korean and other East Asian ethnic groups, probably a generalized hostility towards any Asian American. There was banning of the German language, or even Russian as well, in today's times. But back then, there was a banning of the German language being taught in many schools. Things like Frankfurters were renamed hot dogs actually during this period of time. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage or something like that. Very much reminiscent of what happened in French culture in the United States when France did not support the Bush administration's decision to go to war in Iraq. French toast became freedom toast, and French fries became freedom fries, and French kissing became, I guess, freedom kissing or something like that. Really, really stupid stuff. But, unfortunately, this is the level in which people operate at many times. Anyway, on a more serious note, very severe immigration quotas were passed after World War I in the 1920s. And what it did is it took a very significant toll on the number of immigrants coming into the United States. And I think this is a more updated chart. It goes up to 2021. Good. So what you see here is basically the one line shows you the percentage of immigrants within the United States, and the other, the gray bar, basically shows you the total numbers. And you can see that, in the early 20th century, by about 1910, immigrants made up almost 15% of the population. Not a significantly large amount, but relative to the American, population, or relative to the number of immigrants at other points in time, fairly significant percentage of people. But after that immigration quota is passed, you can see it very quickly starts to decline to the point where you get to 1970, only less than 5% of immigrants within the United States. Now that's almost perfectly correlates with the immigration quota within the United States. It was passed in the early 1920s, and it lasted until the late 1960s. And you can see quite clearly that significantly cut down the number of immigrants, both as a percentage of the population and in terms of the real numbers of millions of people living within the country at the same time. Since then, it has climbed. Whereas in 2021, and these are all estimates to a certain extent, you have 46 million immigrants living within the United States, but still only making up about 14% of the population, obviously because the overall population has grown so much larger. Here you see famous image of the meeting of the railroads, which were largely built with Chinese labor. You won't see any Chinese people within this picture as well. So anti-China sentiment has been around for a long time. In fact, prior to the immigration quota, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act passed in the 1880s, which basically barred immigration from China. So there's a long, I don't mean to suggest that anti-Asian sentiment is a new phenomenon within this country. It's a very long-standing thing. Here are some of the actual Chinese laborers that you can see that would have worked here. And how do we repay these people that helped build the railroads, which are so important in the development of the United States? We literally kicked them in the ass and kicked them out of the country, as you can see here. This one is actually an advertisement for laundry detergent, because there was this stereotype about Chinese laundries, which I guess still exist today. So they're saying, when this Chinese exclusion bill was passed, they're saying, well, look, don't worry, you don't need to, go to the Chinese laundry anymore. You could just buy the good, the good American-made laundry detergent or something like that. And you can see another bill celebrating that as well. I'll leave it to people to read it. Now, Bourne, this is going back to Bourne again. There are certain aspects of what Bourne is saying, though, that I think have not particularly aged well. He says, let us not speak of inferior races, but of inferior civilizations. Well, what does he mean by that? This is kind of this modern day argument that people have that they try to, I'm not suggesting that Bourne himself was racist. I don't really know. But a lot of modern day bigots try to hide it behind this idea. Well, we're not really opposed to any one race. We just don't like certain cultural values and things like that, which I think is just another way of trying to hide that. by saying, oh, well, just these, these cultures have things we don't like. We don't have anything against Muslims per se. We just don't like certain things about Muslim culture, which to me is pretty much saying the same thing. He does at least say we are all to educate and to be educated. These peoples in America are in a common enterprise. It is not what we are now that concerns us, but what this plastic next generation may become in the light of a new cosmopolitan idea. He's at least saying that, we can learn things from other cultures as well. He talks a little bit about assimilation. I realize I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to start to run through this faster. Again, impose the dominant culture, the tyranny of the majority, as you will. Now, another thing I think he says that is interesting and hasn't aged particularly well is that he tends to talk about the South as a very stagnant place, seemingly ignores the presence of African Americans within the South. He says the South still remains an English colony, stagnant and complacent, having progressed culturally scarcely beyond the early Victorian era. It is culturally sterile because it has no advantage of cross-fertilization like the northern states. Now, to a certain extent, what he's saying is true in the sense of the Southern ruling class, the Jim Crow segregation system that existed there. But that's still not a good excuse to completely erase the presence of African Americans within the South. And here's another interesting thing. Well, going back to the sort of cultural question, think how much, of contemporary American culture depends upon non-white people, non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant people. Think of the contributions just made by Black people to the United States. I mean, almost all the popular music, starting with the blues, which then gives birth to jazz, rhythm and blues, rock music, and of course, hip hop after that. Or think of the contributions that Jewish people have made to the culture. I just mentioned, Jack Kirby a moment ago. Or it is a real thing. It's not necessarily a stereotype to talk about Jews in Hollywood. That is a real thing. I mean, less so now. But when it started, again, because when Hollywood really started in the early 20th century, the reason why so many Jewish people got involved in the movie industry was, again, because they were excluded from most other careers and professions. And believe it or not, the movie industry was seen as like a lower thing. Maybe it still is in some regard. So a lot of Jewish people did move into the movie industry and essentially built up the Hollywood movie industry, as well as other things. So I mean, imagine what American popular culture would be like today, just without the contributions made by Black people and by Jewish people, by African Americans and by Jewish Americans. It's hard to imagine almost, I mean, it's certainly not a place I would want to live in. And of course, other cultures have contributed, to a significant extent as well. But I would argue, I think it's probably fairly safe to say that African Americans have contributed the most to American culture, and yet largely unappreciated, certainly not appreciated in Bourne's time. So I think a major oversight on his part. Now, I've sort of put this off for a while, and maybe this will be the last thing I talk about, and I'll kind of wrap things up. There are a few more slides, but I don't think we have to get through all of them. So Blacks, obviously, within the United States play a significant role in that they're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but they're not immigrants either. Now, do they form a nation, right? Bourne's idea is transnational America, meaning different nations sort of come together and sort of make up this sort of nation made up of other nations. Well, what is the idea of the Black nation or Black nationalism, which is a real thing, which is a real concept? So one person who talked about this even during Bourne's time is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was around for a very long time and has a very sort of interesting career, in that he kind of starts off sort of as a liberal. He found the NAACP, one of the founders of the NAACP in 1909. So this is very much in Bourne's period of time. Lived a very long life, lived to his 90s, died in the 1960s. By the end of his life, had become a communist, had joined the Communist Party, had moved to Africa, and had become a very strident Black nationalist. In one of his earliest works, a book known as The Souls of Black Folk, written in, I think, 1903, he talks about this idea of double consciousness, that African Americans, or in the parlance of the day, the Negro, had a kind of, a term he uses himself, had a kind of double consciousness, he says, which I think is very interesting. And I think plays into what Bourne is talking about as well, is that different groups have, to a certain extent, though not in the same way, their own consciousness. They have their own sort of culture and customs, which then sort of merges into the larger American culture as well. Anyway, to give sort of a brief overview of what he's talking about here, this idea of double consciousness refers to the internal conflict and duality of identity experienced by African Americans due to the historical legacy of slavery, racism, and segregation. So that alone shows you why it's distinct from any other group. It is a sense of having two distinct identities, one as an American citizen and the other as an African American, often viewed and treated as, quote, other or different in the larger society. Now, I remember comedians like Dave, I think it was Dave Chappelle, have talked about this, or maybe it's Chris Rock, but how, and they're making a joke about it, so they're exaggerating things, but how Black people have two different ways of talking. There's one way they talk when they're on a job interview, and then the way they talk, when they're with their friends. That would at least be one sort of, I think, example of what is being talked about here. But again, Du Bois goes on to talk about the so-called Negro identity is how African Americans perceive themselves and their own culture, history, and experiences within their community. The American identity is the perception of African Americans as seen through the eyes of the dominant white culture. It encompasses the stereotypes, prejudices, and discriminatory attitudes projected onto them by the majority society. Now, obviously, there are historically unique aspects to the African American experience, which cannot be shared by any other group. But to some extent, this tension between majority and minority, which you see in the writings of Tocqueville, which you see in the writings of Bourne, and things like that, it speaks to a certain similarity, but obviously very different at the same time. And as far as it sort of gives birth to a kind of distinct national identity, it remains to be seen how exactly does the so-called Black nation, or people, I guess, prefer the term Black community. Though I always felt the term community gets overused a lot, not just in terms of the Black community, but the people talk about the gay community and this community and that community. I mean, doesn't community kind of mean like a small scale, like people you see, face to face? Maybe it's because the term Black nation has a different kind of ring to it. It's much more associated with the Black Power movement of the late 1960s. And we'll be talking about Malcolm X and people like that later on in the semester. Du Bois himself, like I said, lived so long that he was sort of intellectually active from the 1890s, basically up until the 1960s. So he lived through most of these periods. And you can sort of see his own evolution as well. But relating this back to what Bourne is talking about, is there a way to incorporate the Black nation within the framework of what he calls transnational America, in that you have a framework that respects cultural differences, does not try to suppress them, and sort of allows them full expression, while also sort of linking it up to a sort of larger culture, or political culture, at least, at the same time. I think there's been some progress in those areas. We certainly see much more of a presence of Black culture within the United States now, though obviously due in no small part to the efforts of people like Du Bois and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and various others. And they're, even their children as well. Malcolm X had 6 daughters, one of whom, Elisha Shabazz, actually teaches here at CUNY, not here at Lehman College, unfortunately, but here at John John Jay College, which was part of CUNY. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure what department she teaches in specifically. I don't work there, but in the 1960s, you see the creation of African studies and different formerly suppressed cultures being able to further the study and the knowledge of their own cultures. I know, this is something that right wingers in this country like to go after and target a lot. But I think it's a great thing. I think there certainly should be more study for it, and by that I also mean much more funding for education like that as well. That does not seem to be forthcoming within the United States. All right, so I think I'll pretty much wrap things up here. I've been talking for quite a while. I'm trying to keep these to about an hour, and so far I've gone well over that. I'll try hard to keep the next one about an hour. If you have any questions or anything, please let me know. Otherwise, that's it. Okay, so take care.